Detective Calvin Cross knew New Orleans like the back of his hand. The way the air thickened before a storm, the scent of sweet magnolias masking the rot of the bayou, and the unspoken rules that divided its people. He had spent years navigating the city's underbelly, balancing his identity as a biracial man in a town that still whispered about bloodlines. But nothing had prepared him for the horror he now faced. The body lay sprawled in an alley off Bourbon Street, the dim glow of a flickering neon sign casting eerie shadows over the twisted form. Blood pooled beneath the victim, seeping into the cracks of the pavement as if the city itself were swallowing the crime. The victim was Malcolm Hayes, a well-known activist who had been rallying for police reform. His mouth was stuffed with torn pages from a history book, his wrists bound with barbed wire. This wasn't just a murder, it was a message. Calvin felt a familiar weight settle on his chest as he stood over Malcolm's body. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that churned his stomach. It was the unmistakable scent of history repeating itself. His father, a civil rights lawyer, had spent his life fighting the same battles Malcolm had championed. And now Malcolm was dead. Was this a warning? A challenge? He swallowed his rage and turned to his partner, Detective Jake Marrow, a white man with a hardened jaw and weary eyes. Whoever did this wanted to send a message, Calvin said, his voice tight. Jake exhaled sharply. Yeah, and I think we both know who'd want to silence a man like Malcolm. Calvin clenched his fists. He knew exactly where to start looking. And he knew this case would pull him into the darkest corners of the city, places even he might not escape. The precinct was alive with murmurs as Calvin and Jake stepped through the doors. Eyes flickered toward them, some filled with curiosity, others with something colder. Everyone knew what Malcolm Hayes had stood for, and everyone knew that whoever had killed him wasn't just another street thug looking for trouble. Captain Harris, a grizzled man with a gut full of cynicism, waved them into his office. This case is already getting heat, he grunted, tossing a file onto the desk. We got calls from reporters, city officials, hell, even the mayor's office. They want this wrapped up fast. Calvin narrowed his eyes. Wrapped up or buried? Harris held his gaze for a beat too long before looking away. Just do your job, Cross. And watch your back. Calvin knew better than to take warnings lightly, but this one left a cold weight in his gut. As he and Jake combed through Malcolm's records, a pattern emerged, one that sent a shiver down Calvin's spine. Several activists had received anonymous threats in recent months, but Malcolm had been the only one to push forward despite the danger. His last known meeting had been with a woman named Angela Dupree, a journalist who had been investigating police corruption. Calvin tapped her name on the screen. We need to find her. Now. Something told him she held the key to a truth no one wanted uncovered. And if they weren't careful, Malcolm wouldn't be the last body they found. Angela Dupree lived in the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights had long given up and the shadows had grown teeth. As Calvin and Jake approached her apartment, a sense of unease settled over them. The air was thick with the scent of rain and something more elusive, fear. Calvin knocked twice. Silence. He knocked again, harder. A rustle came from inside, followed by the slow creak of the door opening just an inch. A pair of wary eyes peered out. Who are you? The voice was tight, cautious. Detective Cross, NOPD. This is my partner, Detective Marrow. We need to talk. Angela hesitated before unlatching the door. The apartment was small, cluttered with stacks of newspapers and scribbled notes. Maps were pinned to the walls with red string connecting key locations. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat beside her laptop, the screen still glowing with half-finished research. I told Malcolm he was getting too close, she said, her voice brittle. But he wouldn't stop. He believed people needed to know. Calvin scanned the notes. Mentions of police misconduct, missing persons, deep ties to something called the Brotherhood. The name sent a chill through him. He had heard whispers of it before, a white supremacist group that operated in the city's shadows, erasing anyone who stood in their way. Did Malcolm mention anything specific? Names, places? Angela hesitated, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup. He said he had proof, but he didn't trust the police. He was going to meet someone high up, but he never told me who. Jake glanced at Calvin. Sounds like we need to figure out who that was before they come looking for her next. Calvin nodded, his gut tightening. They were already running out of time. Angela's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Malcolm left me a voicemail the night before he died, she said, pulling up the message. She hit play, and Malcolm's voice, steady but laced with urgency, filled the room. Angela, I've got it. I finally got it. Proof that the Brotherhood is deeper than we thought. This goes all the way up, but they know I'm onto them. If anything happens to me, tell Cross he needs to go to St. Augustine's Cemetery. Look for the angel with the broken wing. It's there. The message cut off abruptly. A lump formed in Calvin's throat. The Brotherhood had been a ghost story in the Force for years. Whispers of a network embedded deep within the system, protecting their own, silencing threats. But Malcolm had found something real, and it had cost him his life. Jake exhaled sharply. You thinking what I'm thinking? Yeah, Calvin muttered. If Malcolm hid something there, we need to find it before they do. Angela's face was pale. You don't understand. If Malcolm figured this out, they won't just be watching you. They'll be watching me too. A sudden noise outside made them all freeze. The scrape of a shoe against the pavement. A shadow shifting near the window. Calvin's instincts kicked in. He signaled for silence, his hand hovering over his holster as he crept toward the door. He yanked it open, just in time to see a dark figure vanish into the night. His blood ran cold. They weren't just running out of time. They were already being hunted. Calvin bolted down the hallway, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. By the time he reached the street, the figure had already disappeared into the thick New Orleans night. Jake joined him, scanning the dimly lit road. Whoever that was, they knew we were here, he muttered. And they wanted us to know they were watching. Angela stood in the doorway, arms wrapped tightly around herself. This is bad. They don't make threats. When they watch you, it means they're deciding how to get rid of you. Calvin clenched his jaw. Then we don't give him that chance. We move now. He turned to Jake. We need to get to that cemetery. Tonight. Jake nodded. Let's go. Before we find out what happens to people who wait. The cemetery was silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the Spanish moss. St. Augustine had always carried an eerie stillness, but tonight it felt like the dead were holding their breath. Calvin and Jake moved cautiously between the tombstones, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Then they saw it, the angel statue, its left wing snapped clean off. As Calvin and Jake approached the angel with the broken wing, a sense of unease settles over them. The marble figure looms in the moonlight, its shadow stretching long over the grass. Calvin runs his fingers over the statue's base, searching for anything unusual. Then he spots it, scratches along the stone, as if someone had pried something loose. Jake kneels beside him, brushing away damp leaves and dirt. There's something here, he mutters, feeling along the cracks. With a sharp tug, a loose stone shifts, revealing a small, rusted metal box hidden inside. Calvin exhales, wiping sweat from his brow. Malcolm wasn't lying. Just as he reaches for the box, a sound snaps through the silence, a twig breaking underfoot. Calvin and Jake freeze. A low, rustling follows, then the unmistakable metallic click of a gun being cocked. They're not alone. A voice drifts through the shadows. Step away from the statue, detectives. Calvin grips the box, his pulse hammering. Jake slowly raises his hands, his body tensed for a fight. From behind the mausoleums, figures emerge, at least 3, dressed in dark clothing. The faint glow of their weapons glints in the night. Calvin's mind races. If the Brotherhood sent these men, they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to clean up loose ends. The night air was thick with tension. The 3 men moved in closer, their silhouettes barely visible against the moonlit tombstones. Calvin kept his grip firm on the rusted box, his heart hammering against his ribs. Jake's breathing was slow, controlled, his years in law enforcement kicking in. But even he knew they were at a disadvantage. You really shouldn't be here, detective, one of the men said, his voice laced with quiet menace. That box doesn't belong to you. Calvin forced a smirk, masking the tight knot of fear in his chest. That's so? 'Cause last I checked, hiding evidence in a cemetery isn't exactly legal. The man stepped forward. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but the outline of a scar ran from his temple down to his jaw. His fingers flexed over the grip of his gun. "We're not the law," he said simply, "and we don't play by your rules." Jake shifted slightly, angling himself in front of Calvin just enough to be ready for a move. "If you shoot us here, you realize how bad that looks, right?" Jake said, his voice even. Two detectives found dead in a cemetery after investigating a white supremacist group? Yeah, you'd be making headlines. The man with the scar let out a low chuckle. "Oh, we're smarter than that." Then, without warning, the cemetery lights cut out, plunging them all into darkness. A second later, the sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere behind the tombstones. Fast, urgent. Calvin's instincts screamed at him to move. "Run," he barked, shoving Jake as he pivoted, gripping the box tight. A gunshot exploded behind them, splintering the angel statue's wing into a cloud of dust and stone. Jake pulled his weapon, firing blindly over his shoulder as they darted between graves. More shots rang out. Calvin felt something hot graze his arm, too close. Adrenaline surged through him as he stumbled forward, his foot catching on an uneven patch of dirt. A hand yanked him forward before he hit the ground. "Malcolm, come on," the informant hissed. "I know a way out." Calvin barely had time to register the sudden turn of events before Marrow dragged him toward an open mausoleum. Jake followed, covering their retreat with two more shots. They slammed the heavy stone door shut just as another round of gunfire lit up the graveyard. The sound of bullets ricocheting off marble and metal filled the space outside. Panting, Calvin pressed his back against the cold stone wall. He clutched the box tighter, sweat mixing with the blood seeping from his grazed arm. What the hell just happened? Malcolm exhaled sharply. "You were about to get killed. You think these people play fair?" He shook his head, eyes scanning the darkness inside the mausoleum. "They're not going to stop until you're in the ground, detective. You and everyone you care about." Jake checked his ammo. "Then we need to find out what's in that damn box before they do." Calvin nodded, his grip tightening. Whatever secrets lay inside, they were dangerous enough to kill for. And he wasn't about to die without knowing why. The rusted box sat between them, its presence heavy with the weight of secrets buried for decades. The Brotherhood had killed to keep this hidden, and as Calvin pried open the lid, he understood why. Inside, beneath layers of dust and time, lay a collection of documents, photographs, and a single cassette tape labeled Confession. The papers were brittle, the ink faded, but the words still carried the weight of damnation. Names, dates, transactions. The Brotherhood's hidden ledger, chronicling decades of corruption, murders disguised as accidents, missing persons who had never been searched for, and the quiet infiltration of the city's institutions. Judges, police officers, politicians, the very people sworn to protect and serve, were listed with payments beside their names. Some had been bought. Others had been silenced. Jake's breath hitched as he lifted a grainy black and white photograph. Jesus, his fingers tightened around the edges. The image showed a group of men in dark suits standing in front of a burning cross, their faces barely visible in the flickering light. But one face was unmistakable. Calvin exhaled sharply. Captain Harris, their own commanding officer, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Brotherhood. But it was the cassette tape that sent a chill through Calvin's spine. He turned it over, reading the single word scrawled on the label. Confession. Angela stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Malcolm must have found this. That's why they killed him." Calvin nodded, his jaw tightening. "If this tape holds what I think it does, it's not just proof of their existence. It's their death sentence." Jake swallowed hard. "And that's why they'll do whatever it takes to erase it." From outside, the wind shifted, rustling the overgrown grass between the gravestones. But Calvin knew it wasn't the wind. They weren't alone. Captain Harris had worn his badge for over 30 years, a man revered in the department, known for his discipline, his unshakable command, and his ability to make problems disappear. To most, he was a decorated officer, a man who had climbed the ranks through grit and loyalty. But to those who knew the truth, Harris was something else entirely. A gatekeeper for the Brotherhood, the silent force that kept the city in check. The Brotherhood wasn't just a white supremacist group. It was a machine, an unseen hand that had controlled New Orleans for decades. The police force, the courts, the local government, they had their fingers in everything. And Harris? He was their enforcer. He had joined the police force in the late 80s when corruption wasn't just rampant. It was expected. He learned quickly that real power wasn't in the badge or the law, but in knowing which lines to cross and which to erase. The Brotherhood saw his potential early. They needed men in uniform, men who could ensure that investigations went cold, that certain suspects never saw the inside of a courtroom, that voices were silenced before they became problems. Harris had proven himself time and time again. He helped cover up hate crimes, framed innocent black men for crimes they never committed, and ensured that those who challenged the system either vanished or were buried under fabricated charges. When activists became too loud, he made them disappear. When a black-owned business threatened to disrupt the Brotherhood's economic control, mysterious fires would erupt overnight. Over the years, he became indispensable. He didn't just enforce their will, he thrived in it. And with every dirty deed, everybody buried, he climbed higher in the ranks, eventually landing as captain of the force. But now, with the rusted box uncovered and the cassette tape labeled confession in Calvin's hands, everything Harris had built was teetering on the edge of collapse. If that tape held his voice, if it contained proof of his dealings, the Brotherhood wouldn't just discard him. They would erase him like they had erased so many before. And Captain Harris was a man who had spent his entire life ensuring he was the one who pulled the trigger, not the one standing in front of it. Calvin's fingers trembled as he slid the cassette tape into his pocket. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant rustling beyond the mausoleum door. The Brotherhood had killed for this tape. They had murdered Malcolm. They had buried their crimes deep beneath the city's history. And now, Calvin held the key to unraveling it all. Jake glanced at the box, his jaw tightening. If this is what I think it is, we're holding a death sentence for them and maybe for us. Calvin met his partner's eyes, his grip tightening around the evidence. Then we make sure it sees the light of day. Angela, standing close, exhaled sharply. We need to listen to that tape. Now. But before Calvin could respond, a low creak cut through the silence. The mausoleum door. It wasn't the wind. Someone was here. Jake reacted first, killing his flashlight and pressing himself against the cold stone wall. Calvin did the same, his heart hammering. Angela crouched low, her breath slow and controlled. The darkness swallowed them whole. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Calvin reached for his gun, the grip familiar and steady despite the sweat on his palms. The intruder moved deeper inside. A shadow stretched against the moonlit entrance. A shape loomed, silhouetted against the crypt's dim glow. And then a voice. Low, cold, amused. You should have left the past buried, detective. Calvin knew that voice. Captain Harris. His blood ran cold as the realization settled in. The Brotherhood wasn't sending someone to clean up their mess. They had come personally, and Harris wasn't here to negotiate. Harris stepped forward, his boots scraping against the mausoleum's stone floor. The dim moonlight caught the sharp lines of his face, calm, confident, and utterly unbothered by the fact that he was standing in a crypt filled with evidence of his crimes. He was a man who had spent decades untouchable, and that confidence dripped from every word he spoke. You've been digging where you shouldn't, son, Harris said, his voice smooth, almost fatherly. He let the words hang in the air, knowing exactly how much weight they carried. And that ain't good for your health. Calvin's grip on his gun tightened, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. Harris wasn't alone. He could hear the faint shuffling of footsteps outside. The Brotherhood had come prepared. Jake shifted beside him, his breathing steady but controlled. Angela didn't move, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. I'm guessing you already know what's on that tape, Calvin said, his voice level despite the heat rising in his chest. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Harris smirked. Oh, I know exactly what's on that tape. Just like I know what's in that box. That's why I can't let you walk out of here with it. He took another step forward, slowly, deliberately. See, you don't understand how deep this runs, son. You think you found something big. This ain't even a fraction of what we've built. His eyes darkened. And if you think exposing me is going to take us down, you're dumber than I thought. Calvin forced himself to stay still, but the rage inside him burned. He wanted to shove that tape in Harris's face, wanted to scream about Malcolm, about every activist, every innocent life this man had helped erase. Instead, he said, "You sound nervous, Captain." Harris chuckled. Nervous? Son, I'm giving you a choice. His voice dropped lower, deadlier. You hand over that tape, and you and your friends get to walk out of here. You keep pushing, you'll end up just like Malcolm. Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Calvin stared at the man who had been his superior, the man he had once respected, and felt nothing but disgust. Then he did something Harris didn't expect. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, Calvin said. Then, before Harris could react, he pulled the tape from his pocket and smashed it against the stone floor. The plastic shattered, the tape ribbon twisting like a dead snake. Harris's smug expression faltered for the first time. You think that was the only copy? Calvin asked, tilting his head. You trained me better than that, Captain. Harris's jaw clenched. Where is it? Calvin took a slow step back, his smirk unwavering. Let's just say if we don't walk out of here alive, that tape is going to be played on every damn news station in the country. For the first time, Harris hesitated. That was all the opening Calvin needed. Now, Calvin said, raising his gun, why don't you be a good cop, Captain, and put your hands where I can see them? For a split second, nobody moved. The air inside the crypt was thick, heavy with the weight of decades of secrets and the ghosts of those the Brotherhood had buried, both figuratively and literally. Then, Harris exhaled sharply, his lips curling into a smirk. You really think that little bluff is going to scare me, boy? His voice dripped with condescension, but Calvin saw it. The slight twitch in his jaw, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Harris might have been ruthless, but he wasn't reckless. The possibility of that tape being out there had shaken him. Calvin didn't lower his gun. I think you're out of time, Captain. Harris's fingers twitched near his belt. A second later, the crypt erupted into chaos. The first gunshot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. Harris lunged to the side, his hand pulling his own weapon as Calvin fired, his bullet grazing the captain's shoulder. Harris grunted, but kept moving, diving for cover behind a stone coffin. The Brotherhood's men outside reacted instantly. The mausoleum doors burst open, and 3 figures stormed in, their weapons raised. Angela was faster. She dropped low, firing 2 quick shots. One man stumbled back, clutching his leg, howling in pain. Jake took the second guy, his bullet catching the thug in the chest. The third attacker fired wildly, the muzzle flash illuminating the crypt in bursts of deadly light. Calvin ducked behind an old tomb, heart hammering. Harris was pinned down, but he was still alive. That was a problem. Then, a voice cut through the chaos. You don't walk out of here alive, Calvin. Harris shouted. You're playing a game you don't understand. Calvin gritted his teeth, peeking out just in time to see Harris reload. The bastard was stalling, waiting for reinforcements. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before more of the Brotherhood's enforcers arrived. We need to move, Angela shouted. She was crouched near the broken cassette tape, covering their flank. Jake was by the entrance, keeping their escape route clear. Calvin locked eyes with Harris. You're right, Calvin called back. I don't understand everything, but I understand one thing. You're afraid. Harris didn't respond. Calvin took his shot. The bullet struck the edge of the coffin, splintering the stone. Harris flinched, just enough for Calvin to close the distance. He leapt over the tomb, tackling the older man to the ground. The gun flew from Harris's hand, skidding across the floor. The captain swung, his fist connecting with Calvin's ribs, knocking the breath from his lungs. But Calvin had fought too many street fights as a kid to let up now. He grabbed Harris by the collar and slammed his head against the floor. Blood smeared the cold stone. Harris groaned, dazed. Outside, More gunfire erupted. The Brotherhood's backup had arrived. "We gotta go," Jake yelled, firing at the new arrivals. Angela tossed Calvin a look. "You taking him or leaving him?" Calvin stared down at Harris, breathing hard. The man was bloodied, but still alive. Calvin wanted to kill him. He wanted to make him pay. But there was a better punishment. "We're taking him," Calvin growled. "Let's see how loyal his Brotherhood really is when the truth comes out." With that, he grabbed Harris by the collar and dragged him toward the door. The battle wasn't over. But tonight, they had won the first round. Calvin hauled Harris to his feet, yanking the older man's arms behind his back as gunfire erupted just outside the crypt. The Brotherhood's reinforcements were closing in fast, their bullets chewing through the stone walls like angry wasps. The air smelled of gunpowder and blood. Jake fired a few rounds toward the entrance, keeping their attackers at bay. "We gotta move now," he barked. Angela pulled a flash grenade from her belt. "Cover your eyes." Calvin barely had time to turn his head before a blinding white light filled the crypt. A deafening bang followed, rattling his skull. The Brotherhood's men shouted in confusion, stumbling as Angela took the lead, sprinting toward the exit. "Go, go," she yelled. Calvin dragged Harris forward, the captain stumbling, his weight slowing them down. The Brotherhood had abandoned him, too busy trying to recover from the flashbang. A twisted smirk formed on Calvin's face. Loyalty only goes so far when you're no longer useful. The three of them burst out into the graveyard, where the night air was thick with smoke. A black SUV screeched to a stop near the gates. More Brotherhood men piled out, their rifles glinting under the moonlight. Jake cursed. "They're blocking the exit." Angela didn't hesitate. She veered left, leading them between rows of crumbling tombstones. Bullets whizzed past, shattering marble and sending debris flying. Calvin ducked, forcing Harris along. "If we don't make out of here, you're going down with us, Captain," he growled in his ear. Harris let out a dark chuckle despite the situation. "You think this ends with me?" His voice was strained but confident. "I'm just one piece of the puzzle, kid." Calvin ignored him. Right now, survival was all that mattered. Angela pointed ahead. "The old caretaker's shed. We can lose them in there." They sprinted toward the rusted shack at the far end of the cemetery. Jake reached it first, kicking the door open. The three of them shoved inside, slamming the door behind them. Heavy breathing. Silence, except for the distant shouts of the Brotherhood's men. Angela peered through a crack in the wooden wall. "They're fanning out. We don't have much time." Calvin looked at Harris, his grip tightening on the captain's collar. "You're going to help us get out of here." Harris smirked, blood dripping from his split lip. "And why the hell would I do that?" Calvin leaned in, his voice a dangerous whisper. "Because if we die, that tape goes public. And your friends in the Brotherhood? They'll rip you apart for letting it happen." Harris's smirk faded. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. Jake reloaded his gun. "So, Captain, what's it gonna be?" Harris clenched his jaw, eyes darting between the three of them. The weight of Calvin's words pressed on him. He knew how the Brotherhood operated. If they thought he was compromised, they wouldn't hesitate to make him disappear. His hesitation lasted only a second before he exhaled sharply, nodding. "There's a sewer tunnel under the graveyard," Harris muttered. "Old maintenance tunnels. The Brotherhood uses them for transport. It'll lead you outside the perimeter." Angela narrowed her eyes. "And you just happen to know about this?" Harris glared at her. "I've been doing their dirty work for years. I know how they think." Calvin yanked him forward. "Then take us there." Now, outside, footsteps crunched on gravel. The Brotherhood's men were closing in. Shadows flickered across the shed's warped wooden walls, the beams creaking under the pressure of the wind. A low voice murmured orders. "They're surrounding the shed," Jake whispered. Harris moved first, shoving a rusted metal cabinet aside to reveal a trapdoor. He kicked it open, revealing a dark, damp hole leading underground. A rotten, earthy stench drifted up, the scent of stagnant water and decay. Jake wrinkled his nose. "That smells like death." "Better than getting a bullet in the head," Calvin muttered. Angela went in first, disappearing into the darkness. Jake followed, then Calvin, dragging Harris down with him. The tunnel was narrow, with old brick walls dripping with condensation. Water sloshed beneath their boots, the tunnel stretching ahead into the unknown. Above them, the shed door burst open. "They're gone," a voice shouted. Calvin exhaled, his grip tightening on Harris's shirt. "Keep moving." Harris smirked. "I hope you're ready, detective." Calvin frowned. "For what?" "For what comes next." The tunnel suddenly split into two paths, and before Calvin could react, Harris jerked forward, elbowing him hard in the ribs. The air rushed from his lungs as Harris yanked free, sprinting down the left path. "Son of a—" Jake raised his gun, but Harris was already gone, swallowed by the darkness. Angela cursed under her breath. "We should have killed him when we had the chance." Calvin straightened, rubbing his ribs. "No, we follow him. He's leading us straight to the Brotherhood's real hideout." Jake nodded grimly. "Then let's end this." Without hesitation, they ran into the shadows, chasing the man who had just betrayed them. The tunnel twisted and turned like a snake beneath the city, its damp walls closing in as Calvin, Angela, and Jake sprinted after Harris. The flickering light from their flashlights barely cut through the darkness, revealing only the slick brick and the occasional rat skittering away from their pounding footsteps. "Harris knows these tunnels," Jake panted. "If he gets too far ahead, we'll lose him." Calvin pushed forward, ignoring the dull ache in his ribs from Harris's strike. "Not happening." A distant metallic clang echoed through the tunnel. Harris was opening something, maybe a hidden door or a grate. They couldn't let him slip away. Angela, running just behind Calvin, gritted her teeth. "We should have put a bullet in his knee when we had the chance." "Yeah? Then he wouldn't be leading us to them right now," Calvin shot back. Another turn, another stretch of damp, narrow passage. Then, suddenly, the tunnel widened into a chamber. At its far end, Harris was prying open a rusted iron door set into the brick wall. Beyond it, a dim, flickering light spilled out, illuminating his face for just a second. He looked desperate. Calvin raised his gun. "Harris, don't move." Harris glanced back, a smirk playing on his bloody lips. Too late. He ducked through the door just as two masked figures in tactical gear emerged from the shadows beside him, their weapons already raised. "Ambush! Get down!" Calvin shouted as the first gunshot rang out. Angela and Jake dove behind an overturned maintenance cart as bullets ricocheted off the walls, sparks flying. Calvin fired back, hitting one of the masked men in the shoulder. He stumbled, cursing, but didn't go down. The other gunman advanced, his rifle trained on Calvin, until Angela took her shot. A clean hit to the throat. He crumpled, gurgling, his weapon clattering to the ground. Harris was gone. Calvin wasted no time. He charged toward the open iron door, Jake and Angela close behind. The moment they crossed the threshold, the underground air changed. No longer damp and stale, but heavier, thick with something darker. The hallway ahead was lit with flickering torches, casting eerie shadows on the walls. A symbol was carved into the stone arch above them, a coiled serpent encircling a blood-red cross. Angela whispered, "We just walked into the Brotherhood's nest." Jake reloaded his gun. "Then let's burn it to the ground." Calvin nodded, gripping his weapon tighter as they stepped forward. Whatever lay ahead, they weren't leaving without ending this. Calvin stormed forward, weapon raised, his pulse hammering in his ears. The Brotherhood's hideout stretched before them, a vast underground chamber filled with crude wooden benches and an altar at its center, draped in blood-red banners marked with the serpent and cross insignia. Torches flickered against the damp stone walls, casting eerie shadows over the assembled figures. Hooded men stood in a half-circle, their eyes locking onto Calvin, Angela, and Jake as they entered. Harris was in the center, kneeling before an older man in a black robe, the Grand Marshal. His voice echoed through the chamber. "You failed us, Harris, and now you've led them here." Harris clenched his jaw. "I did what I had to." A gunshot cut him off. Not from Calvin, from the Grand Marshal himself. Harris gasped, clutching his stomach as blood bloomed across his shirt. He collapsed, coughing, his betrayal punished before he could even beg for his life. Calvin didn't flinch. This was the kind of men they were dealing with. Loyalty meant nothing, only power and control. The Brotherhood ends tonight, Calvin declared, stepping forward. The Grand Marshal smiled. "You're just another idealist, Detective Kane, and you'll die like the rest." With a snap of his fingers, masked men armed with rifles stepped from the shadows. But Calvin, Angela, and Jake were ready. Gunfire erupted, the chamber filled with smoke and the deafening roar of bullets. Calvin ducked behind a stone pillar, returning fire, taking down one, then another. Jake tackled a Brotherhood member, smashing his head against the cold floor. Angela moved with deadly precision, her shots clean and efficient. Then, sirens wailed in the distance. The Brotherhood's faces twisted in realization. Calvin smirked. "You think we came alone?" He had called for backup before they entered the tunnels. The New Orleans PD and the FBI were closing in. As the Brotherhood's men panicked, some dropped their weapons. Others tried to escape through hidden exits, only to be met with armed officers storming in. The Grand Marshal attempted to flee, but Calvin caught him, slamming him against the altar. "You killed Malcolm Hayes," Calvin growled. "You murdered activists. You tried to silence justice." The Grand Marshal sneered. "And yet, people like me will always exist." Calvin pressed his gun to the man's temple. For a moment, he considered ending it right there. But that wasn't justice. Instead, he yanked the Grand Marshal to his feet and shoved him into the waiting arms of the FBI agents. One by one, the Brotherhood members were cuffed, their empire of hate crumbling in front of them. By morning, the news spread like wildfire. Brotherhood exposed. Racist cult taken down in FBI raid. Pictures of the arrested men, including high-profile politicians and business leaders, flooded the media. People finally saw the truth, and Malcolm Hayes' name was cleared. His death wasn't in vain. Calvin stood outside the precinct, watching the sun rise over the city. Angela and Jake stood beside him, exhausted but victorious. "We did it," Angela whispered. Calvin nodded. "Yeah, but there's still more to fight for." Justice wasn't a one-time battle. It was a war fought every day, and he wasn't done yet. If you believe in fighting for justice, let your voice be heard. Subscribe to Tears of Justice, like, share, and comment your thoughts on this story. What would you have done in Calvin's shoes?